Welcome to the Exchange, Policy Exchange's podcast. I'm Ellie Green. In today's episode, I'm joined by Ed Birkett, Research Fellow in the Energy and Environment Unit here at Policy Exchange and author of the report Route 35, which looks at how a California-style ZEV mandate can deliver the phase-out of petrol and diesel cars. You can find the report we will be discussing on the Policy Exchange website, policyexchange.org.uk. So Ed, to start off with, why are we talking about decarbonising transport now?
Thanks, Ellie. What we've seen in the last few years is that the UK has made great progress in decarbonising some sectors of the economy, particularly electricity. But now transport is the biggest contributor to the UK's carbon emissions. If we're going to meet our net zero target by 2050, then transport needs to be decarbonised. The government's introducing a proposed ban on petrol and diesel car sales by 2035 or earlier, and is also preparing the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which will be out later this year.
The Financial Times described your report as urging the government to adopt California's policy on electric vehicles. Can you tell us what's wrong with our current policy and why we should look to California?
Sure. So the UK currently has fuel efficiency standards on manufacturers, which limit the carbon emissions from cars, and that's part of a European Union-wide regulation on car manufacturers. This scheme has been pretty successful to date, which is why we see more hybrid and battery electric vehicles on the road nowadays. But there are concerns that it's not going to drive down emissions fast enough to meet the government's target of ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2035 or earlier. As we say in our report, those existing UK and EU regulations should be supplemented with a mandate on vehicle manufacturers to sell more zero emission vehicles, which means electric cars or hydrogen powered cars. California has had this so-called ZEV mandate since the 1990s. And as we know, California is a leader in electric vehicles, for example, as the home of electric vehicle manufacturer Tesla.
We know that Tesla has gained lots of attention in the media because of their stock price. And in the report, you mention how they participate in the ZEV mandate in California. So are they a success story for UK car manufacturers to follow suit?
I think so. I think what we saw in California in the 1990s is that the ZEV mandate really encouraged manufacturers to think about how they could introduce zero emission vehicles of various technologies. What we really saw with Tesla emerging around 2010 was that electric vehicles are now the leader, and California has then also been a leader in part because of this ZEV mandate.
So we know that in the UK, car makers are really struggling due to the coronavirus crisis. I was wondering how you can expect them currently to make this rapid change towards a new policy and the ZEV mandate.
I think that's a really good point. The whole car industry globally has really been suffering from a massive fall in car sales during the coronavirus pandemic. I think my sort of pushback would be that any policy to transition to zero emission vehicles by 2035 or earlier, which is the government's aim, will cause a lot of struggle for manufacturers. The advantage of a zero emission vehicle mandate is that it gives manufacturers the certainty about how many vehicles they should sell each year, zero emission vehicles. You have a rising proportion each year, and it gives them clarity on at what point they have to only be selling zero emission vehicles. I think a ZEV mandate, it doesn't stop the government from giving additional support to manufacturers to help them out in the coronavirus pandemic as they recover, and it doesn't stop the government putting in place additional policies to support the manufacturers to move to zero emission vehicles.
Right, and in the report you discuss what Norway has done. They've obviously been a great success story, but they've gone about it in a different way. Why do you think that the Norway model is not really right for the UK?
Yes, so Norway is the global leader in terms of selling the highest proportion of electric vehicles. So they're now over 50% of the cars that are sold in Norway are electric, and that is a brilliant success story. But our concern when we were writing this report is that the model that they've used in Norway it would be too expensive for the UK and could be done cheaper. What they've done in Norway is they have high taxes on petrol and diesel cars, and then tax breaks, so no VAT, for example, on electric cars. But then there's also other benefits like reduced parking fees, reduced road tolls, and reduced fees on ferries. And that's very expensive. And the question for the UK is whether or not that's affordable or appropriate in the UK, and whether we can have look to California, which has a a policy that should be cheaper and lower the costs for both industry and consumers of moving to zero emission vehicles.
Right, and coming on to the impact on consumers, obviously electric vehicles tend to be much more expensive than their petrol diesel equivalents. You're also suggesting that the UK gets rid of the £3,000 plug-in car grant. So I was wondering what the impact on the consumers is going to be if we were to adopt this sort of California-style policy.
Sure. So I think our recommendation to get rid of the plug-in car grant will be controversial, because that does provide consumers with up to £3,000 off the price of a new electric car. I think the problem with the plug-in car grant is it's already cost about £800 million, and it's expected to cost another £400 million in the next 4 years, I think, and that's pretty expensive. And the question is whether or not we can really accelerate the transition to zero emission vehicles cheaper than that. In terms of impact of the zero emission vehicle mandate on the price of cars, what you would see is reductions in the price of electric cars and slight increases in the price of petrol and diesel cars, at least in the early years. In the later years of the scheme, it would mainly just increase the price of petrol and diesel cars and wouldn't have much impact on electric cars. I think really what this ZEV mandate does is it helps to bridge that balance in terms of the cost differential between petrol and diesel and between electric cars.
Right, and have you seen any buy-in from car manufacturers in the UK for this style of policy? Have they come out and said anything either in support or not in support of this?
I think manufacturers have been more reluctant to support a policy like this, in part due to concerns that the government might just introduce a zero emission vehicle mandate and then consider it sort of job done, and that policy is all that's needed. I think we've been very clear in our report that that's not the case, and that the ZEV mandate would need to be supported by what we're calling complementary policies. So, for example, to support the development of electric vehicle charging networks. I think another thing to say is that a lot of the fleet owners, so companies that own big vehicle fleets like delivery vans and things, they have called for a zero emission vehicle mandate to help to increase the supply of electric cars and vans. And the Committee on Climate Change, the government's independent advisors on climate change, have also suggested that a zero emission vehicle mandate is part of the solution.
Right. And when you talk about in the report, you sort of touch on some of these complementary policies that would be able to support this mandate. Could you outline what these are and why they would be so important?
Sure. So as I said just a second ago, the ZEV mandate does need it. It's not a standalone policy. It does need to be supported by complementary policies to drive down the cost of the transition to electric vehicles and other zero emission vehicles. The complementary policies that we've outlined include electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and that's both rapid chargers on motorways and A roads, but also support for on-street charging in residential areas, so like overnight charging for people who don't have a driveway and therefore can't charge in their home. We've also said that the government's proposals for green number plates for electric vehicles, so that people can identify electric and other zero emission vehicles, is a good idea, and that should be coming in this autumn. And the final thing is the introduction of clean air zones. So, for example, in London, we have the ultra low emission zone that charges people if they drive a polluting vehicle into our most polluted cities. We think those should be expanded. It's something we've called for a few years at Policy Exchange, as long as it targets the most polluting vehicles to try and discourage them from driving in our city centres.
And do you think actually that city centres obviously pose a unique issue in the UK? Because I understand how in the suburbs it'll be easier to sort of have these electric vehicles and have these charging points. But do you think it would involve, an overhaul of our streets? Would urban planning have to come into play if we were to do this in London and other big cities across the UK?
So I think there's 2 points on that. The first one is that in terms of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, there are more challenges doing it in city centres, in part because electricity demand is high and so there's not much space on the networks to add new chargers. but also because fewer people have a driveway that they can park on. So the infrastructure for recharging needs to be in the street. And this is something we're going to look at later in the year. We're hoping to do a report on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The second point about urban areas is that during the coronavirus, we've seen moves to pedestrianise more areas of city centres and to introduce new bike lanes. I think a zero emission vehicle mandate sort of doesn't really change those policies. So, if we're going to have cars in our city centres, they should be zero emission. But then it's really for other people to debate, how much of cities should be pedestrianised. That's not something we've talked about in this report.
Great. And in terms of public transport, how would this report seek to look at how we can make public transport more green?
So this report really focuses on cars and vans. So it's really about personal vehicles and also fleets owned by big companies that have lots of delivery fleets or sort of maintenance workers and things like that. We haven't taken on public transport. I think a zero emission vehicle mandate might not be the right approach in public transport, because public transport, as you can imagine, is already a very highly regulated space, because it's sort of procured or controlled by local governments. So one thing we did mention in the report is in London, there are regulations that control the emissions from new taxis, which I guess isn't public transport, but is sort of similar in some ways. But you could sort of see those regulations being extended to cover buses, so that more buses have to be zero emission. We know the government's already introduced an all-electric bus town pilot and might be bringing forward proposals for a all-hydrogen bus town. So there's probably different approaches for decarbonising public transport.
Right. And obviously the forward was written by Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary. In terms of the government support of this, are you confident that there are moves towards adopting a policy like this?
Well, it was great to get a forward from the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who was talking about how transports now are our leading source of greenhouse gas emissions, and also how clean transport is one of the 5 key themes at the COP26 climate conference that the UK is hosting in Glasgow next year. The government is looking pretty hard at transport decarbonisation now, both in terms of this consultation that is going on at the moment about phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars, and also the transport decarbonisation plan, which will be out later this year. I'm hopeful that the government will look very closely at this proposal. I think it has a lot of advantages in terms of reducing the cost of the transition to zero emission vehicles. There's also the fact that Brexit gives the UK a chance to look again at regulation that was previously controlled by the EU. And a zero emission vehicle mandate would be one example of that, where we could choose to take a different approach to the EU by adopting a California's policy on zero emission vehicles. But obviously, we're both trying to achieve the same aims in terms of phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars.
Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us today, and thank you all for listening. To remind our listeners, you can read the report Route 35 on our website, policyexchange.org.uk. You've been listening to The Exchange. I'm Ellie Green, and this is a Policy Exchange podcast.